Chapter 8. Nehemiah, a man of purpose. Nehemiah 6, 1-3. Now it came to pass, when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had builded the wall, and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set up the doors upon the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. And I sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? Nehemiah was a man of purpose. He was focused on accomplishing the task at hand, the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. Like the Apostle Paul, who would later say in Philippians 3:13, This one thing I do, Nehemiah was also a man who possessed a singleness of heart and mind, and who was dedicated to fulfilling his God-given purpose in life. Like the Apostle Paul, who would later say in Philippians 3:13, This one thing I do, Nehemiah was also a man who possessed a singleness of heart and mind, and who was dedicated to fulfilling his God-given purpose in life. In verse 3, he said to the messengers of Sanballat, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. He did not say with pride that he was a great man, but rather with purpose he stated that he was employed in a great work. However, the closer Nehemiah came to reaching this goal of rebuilding the wall, the more the enemies of the Lord sought to derail him from his purpose. They were willing to do whatever it took in order to get Nehemiah to come down from the wall. In this chapter, we will look at 3 strategies the enemy used to cause the workmen and the work to cease. An invitation of compromise. Up to this point, Sanballat, Tobiah, and their friends had been unsuccessful at hindering the work of rebuilding the wall through their many threats and acts of open aggression. In fact, from the report given in verse 1 of chapter 6, it would seem that their efforts to stop the work had only strengthened the resolve of both Nehemiah and his followers to complete the wall, for now there was no breach left therein, and all that remained of the project was the setting up of the doors and gates. With the completion of the wall looming, the enemies of the work suddenly chose to change their tactics. Once again, word was sent by Sanballat and his cronies to Nehemiah, but this time there was no saber rattling or threat of legal action. Instead, an invitation was put forth to Nehemiah for him to come and meet together with them to discuss the situation as it currently stood. They suggested that they all meet in one of the villages in the plain of Ono in order to talk things out and come to a mutually satisfactory agreement. After all, couldn't they compromise and choose to meet each other halfway in order to keep peace? However, Nehemiah was not fooled by their seemingly generous offer to begin negotiations, for it was nothing less than an attempt to distract him from the work at hand. He said in the end of verse 2, But they thought to do me mischief. Nehemiah recognized that any time the enemy offers to join your team and help in the work, they always have ulterior motives which are masked with deception. This should come as no surprise to the Christian today, for Satan, the master deceiver, continues to use compromise in order to distract God's people and delay them in their work, so that he may ultimately destroy them. Nehemiah's example teaches us that we cannot and must not negotiate with a dishonest enemy. Nehemiah's response to the messengers of Sanballat and his accomplices was succinct and to the point. Verse 3, And I sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you? He had no time to stop and rethink what God had already put in his heart to do, and he had no desire to cause the work to cease while he went to debate and negotiate with those who had already shown through their actions and their words that they were opposed to the Lord and to the work of rebuilding the wall. In the same way today, the devil is constantly trying to get God's people to stop and debate what the Lord has already declared in his word. Instead of pausing to defend his actions and positions with words, he instead chose to continue building the wall because it was a great work. Verse 3. Nehemiah was not conceited or self-centered in his response to the messengers of Sanballat. Rather, he was focused on accomplishing the task which the Lord had set before him. Because of that, he would not permit himself to leave it and cause the work to cease by coming down from the wall. On 4 different occasions, the servants of Sanballat came to Nehemiah with their message of compromise, but each time he displayed his resolve to stick firmly to his purpose by answering them after the same manner. Verse 4. A story of slander. When their invitation to compromise did not deter Nehemiah from his mission, the enemy next countered with a story of slander. Their plan was to start a whispering campaign that would damage Nehemiah's credibility in the eyes of the Persian government and among the neighboring provinces by questioning the integrity of his motives. This would be done by spreading the rumor that Nehemiah had ulterior motives in rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. According to the report of the heathen, in particular Geshmu, Nehemiah was actually leading the people in a rebellion against the Persian king, and once the walls were completed, he planned to have himself crowned king over the Jewish people. Nehemiah 6, 5-6. Then sent Sanballat his servant unto me in like manner the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand, wherein was written, It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu saith it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause thou buildest the wall, that thou mayest be their king, according to these words. The malicious lie was further enhanced by the baseless accusation that Nehemiah had also appointed prophets to preach about him and proclaim that he was the rightful king of Jerusalem. Verse 7. The invitation that Sanballat offered to Nehemiah in the end of verse 7 to come and take counsel together with him was nothing short of blackmail. He knew well that the reports were false, for he had played a part in making them, but he also knew that these slanderous accusations of rebellion and insurrection against the Persian king could easily cause the work to stop and even bring the death sentence upon Nehemiah. History attests to the fact that many monarchs from the ancient Near East were known for their brutal reprisals against those who attempted to usurp their thrones. Sanballat, in essence, was offering Nehemiah the chance to keep the letter and the false report from spreading any further by coming to him and agreeing to meet his demands. What these demands might have been, to abandon the work or for Nehemiah to leave the province, we will never know, because Nehemiah never stopped working on the wall long enough to meet with Sanballat and learn of his wicked designs. Instead, in verse 8, Nehemiah sent unto him, saying, There are no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest them out of thine own heart. Nehemiah was aware of the fact that Sanballat was trying to blackmail him and intimidate the people. The enemies of the Lord were clearly attempting to weaken the hands of the people from the work. Verse 9, And Nehemiah could do nothing to stop them from spreading their lies. So, in faith, Nehemiah went once again to the Lord in prayer. Nehemiah 6:9. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. A plot to discredit. As the walls around Jerusalem neared completion, the enemies of the Lord made one final attempt to stop the work. They plotted to discredit Nehemiah in the eyes of his own followers. Veterans of the Second World War who fought the Japanese in the Pacific Theater tell us that the enemy snipers would often single out the lieutenant or sergeant in charge of a platoon in order to take out the leader and cause general disorder and chaos among the remaining soldiers. Their attacks on junior officers became so intense that Army headquarters began to issue orders for lieutenants to wear their double-bar insignias on the backs of their helmets so that they could not be identified apart from the other soldiers in their command. In the same way, the enemies of God's people were attempting to destroy the spiritual leader of the Jewish people by targeting Nehemiah. With a discredited leader and a divided workforce, the progress on the walls would come to a screeching halt. Verse 10 introduces us to a man named Shemaiah, who was a prophet in Jerusalem and most likely a priest, for we learn that he had access to the inner areas of the temple. He called for Nehemiah to visit him at his house where he was pretending to be shut up or in hiding for fear of his life. When Nehemiah came to Shemaiah's house, he proceeded to inform Nehemiah that his life was also in danger and suggested that they both go to the temple and shut the doors in order to hide from those who were coming to slay Nehemiah that very night. Nehemiah 6:10. He said, Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night they will come to slay thee. Shemaiah's secret warning to Nehemiah to hide in the temple in order to save his life may have looked like good advice given by a friend at the outset, but thankfully Nehemiah carefully considered both the immediate and eventual results of making such a decision, and he did not put his personal safety above doing that which was right. Nehemiah had to make a choice between what was expedient and what was right. In the end, Nehemiah refused to go with Shemaiah and seek shelter within the temple. In verses 11 through 13, he gives the reasons for his decision. In the first place, he had faced danger and threats of violence before and would no doubt face them again. Therefore, Nehemiah would choose to continue trusting in God. Nehemiah 6:11. And I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. After all, what would that say to the people who had labored in the work with him for the past several weeks and who had chosen to trust in God's provision and protection along with their leader? He would be telling them, by his actions, that God was no longer able to protect them from their enemies. This would surely weaken the hands of the people in a much greater way than Sanballat and Tobiah had been able to do thus far. Secondly, Nehemiah knew that because he was not an ordained priest of the tribe of Levi and descended from the lineage of Aaron, he was not permitted to enter the inner courts of the house of the Lord. To do so would be to disobey God by breaking one of the Old Testament laws, for Numbers 18:7 warned that anyone other than a priest who went beyond the altar of burnt offerings into the holy place, or the Holy of Holies, was guilty of the death penalty. When the prideful King Uzziah attempted to enter the holy place, where God had forbidden all but the priests to enter, he was immediately plagued with leprosy as a result of his willful decision to trespass in the sanctuary of the Lord. 2 Chronicles 26:16 through 19. Nehemiah recognized that God would never instruct him to do wrong in an effort to do right or to save himself. The Lord does not employ pragmatism, the end justifies the means, to accomplish his work. Instead, he is a God of principle. Nehemiah knew that if God wanted to preserve his life from the hands of his enemies, he would do so without causing Nehemiah to violate one of his written laws. And Nehemiah, for his part, was willing to die before he was willing to disobey the Lord by willfully going against one of his commands. The very fact that Shemaiah would suggest a plan to him that involved disobedience to the written word of God revealed to Nehemiah that Shemaiah was nothing more than a false prophet and a hireling of Sanballat and Tobiah. Nehemiah 6:12 through 13. And lo, I perceived that God had not sent him, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me. For Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Therefore was he hired, that I should be afraid and do so and sin, and that they might have matter for an evil report, that they might reproach me. The subsequent verse reveals that there were also several other false prophets, including a prophetess by the name of Noadiah, who had allied with Sanballat and Tobiah with the intention of causing him to run away or back down in fear. Nehemiah said in verse 14 that they would have put him in fear. However, he responded to their deceit and intimidation by praying that the Lord would think upon them according to their works. Thankfully, Nehemiah did not compromise, he did not run, and he did not hide. Instead, he just continued to build the wall. When problems arose, he gave them to the Lord, and then gave himself to the work God had called him to do. Nehemiah's firm adherence to the Scriptures and his personal prayer life prevented him from making a fateful decision that would have caused him to disobey one of God's commands and also be discredited in the eyes of the people. Had he run from the enemy or chosen to save himself by hiding in the sanctuary, Nehemiah's testimony would have been ruined, his ministry would have been ended, and likely the walls around the city would never have been rebuilt in his day. In verse 3, Nehemiah told the enemies of the Lord, I cannot come down, when they attempted to get him to compromise. And in verse 11, Nehemiah said to Shemaiah, I will not go in, when they further plotted to discredit him. Because Nehemiah was doing a great work, he made it clear to both foe and friend alike that he would not be distracted from fulfilling his purpose. His single-minded devotion to the work of rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem caused him to eventually see the task through from its inception to its completion.